Hey everybody. This is a piece from uh, the book Russia from Proletarian Revolution to State Capitalist Counter-Revolution, I believe this was called. Anyway, it's a collection of writings related to Russia by Raya Dunayevskaya. And as you know, Raya Dunayevskaya, along with other people, not together necessarily, with CLR James, obviously she wrote together, but she's part of a broader trend in like the 40s and 50s to break with Trotsky's degenerated worker state thesis and develop a thesis of the USSR as state capitalist. Some of the people to do this, she obviously did it in collaboration with CLR James, and I think to a somewhat lesser extent Grace Lee Boggs. But also Cornelius Castoriadis and Claude Lafleur eventually come to this kind of conclusion, although they kind of seem like they have a bit of a bureaucratic collectivist kind of conception of the USSR, at least initially for the first couple of years of Socialist Mubarak, and then develop a theory of bureaucratic state capitalism. And then another person who was also doing this at this time was Tony Cliff. And obviously there's other people, especially left communists who are not affiliated with Trotskyism, that were saying, arguing that the USSR was a form of state capitalism, such as Helmut Wagner, Paul Matic, I think the milieu around Amadeo Bordiga, and so forth. And initially within the Trotskyist movement, one of the first people to argue that the USSR was state capitalist was a guy named, I believe it's Ryan Worrall. I think the middle initial is L. But he didn't persistently put the case forward, I guess, if that makes sense, right? So it seems like whereas Raya Dunayevskaya, CLR James, and Tony Cliff and Cornelius Castoriadis continuously advocated for this position, it seems like Ryan L. Worrall said his piece, and then that was that. Or at least that's the impression I get. I might be wrong about that. But anyway, the 9th chapter of this book that I'm reading from, Russia from Proletarian Revolution to State Capitalist Counter-Revolution, is titled The Development of State Capitalist Theory in the 40s. I'm going to read the first piece from it, which is titled The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics as a Capitalist Society. But I'm going to read the little introduction first, before I get down to business, reading the actual piece. So, the introduction begins with a quote, "The shock of the Hitler-Stalin Pact in 1939, followed by the outbreak of World War II and Trotsky's call for the defense of Russia, signaled the beginning of the end of world Trotskyism. The many tendencies that sprang up within Trotskyism questioned the very nature of the Russian state and the Russian economy, rather than just the political bureaucratization that Stalin introduced and that Trotsky had fought. I plunged into the study of all the Russian 5-year plans. The most valuable research work was done in the Slavic division of the New York Public Library, the Library of Congress, and Hoover Institute in California. At the time I was engaged in research on the Russian economy of 1928 to 39. I was translating for myself philosophic works of Marx, those that were listed by Ryazanov as, quote, preparatory for the works of the Holy Family, end quote, in which we now know as the famous humanist essays, as well as Lenin's abstract of Hegel's Science of Logic, ... In a word, the relationship between philosophy and economics was intensified. Indeed, by the 1940s, I saw philosophy as inherent in new revolutionary forces, labor, black, women, youth, ... end quote. Raya Dunayevskaya. Raya Dunayevskaya's 1940s writings on the theory of state capitalism, initially begun independently, were developed while Dunayevskaya was co-leader with C.L.R. James of the state capitalist tendency, or Johnson-Forrest tendency, within the Trotskyist movement. Dunayevskaya's analyses, demonstrating Stalin's Russia to be a state capitalist society, not only took issue with Trotsky's continued defense of Russia as a worker state, but critiqued the bureaucratic collectivist analysis of Max Shachtman and others. As Dunayevskaya noted, these economic studies were unseparated from probing the philosophic writings of Marx and Lenin on Hegel and finding, quote, philosophy as inherent in new revolutionary forces, end quote. Thus, the origins of her Marxist humanism are found in state capitalist theory. Several key documents of Dunayevskaya's state capitalist analysis are presented in this chapter. Additional documents on state capitalism can be found in Volume 1 of the Raya Dunayevskaya collection. So, end of introduction, now on to the piece. And the piece again is titled, The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics is a Capitalist Society. It's from February 1941, written under the pseudonym Freddie James, published by the Workers' Party in mimeographed form in an internal discussion bulletin of March 1941. Quote, and even when society has got upon the right track for the discovery of the natural laws of its movement, and it is the ultimate aim of this work, to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, it can neither clear by bold leaps nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development. But it can shorten and lessen the birth pangs, end quote. Karl Marx, Preface to Capital, Volume 1. Section 1. Political and Social Rule. It was the contention of Comrade Leon Trotsky that the existence of statified property in Russia was sufficient to characterize Russia as a workers' state, regardless of the political regime in power. The counter-revolutionary Stalinist bureaucracy, therefore, could and did, though badly, defend the social rule of the proletariat. To thus epitomize the constituent elements of a workers' state is at wide variance with the views held by Marx and Lenin. Let us look at the birth of the Soviet Republic for a verification of their views. In establishing itself as the ruling class, the Russian proletariat not only expropriated the capitalist and landlord, but also guaranteed power to the poor. Political power, a state controlled by them through their own organs, the trade unions, the Soviets, the Bolshevik Party, and social power, which Lenin defined as the, quote, practical participation in the management, end quote, of the state. Lenin emphasized that it was the aim of the Soviet state, quote, to attract every member of the poor class to practical participation in the management, end quote. See Lenin's The International Position of the Russian Soviet Republic and the Fundamental Tasks of the Socialist Revolution, end quote. In the same pamphlet, Soviets at Work, Lenin further elaborated this view, quote, the proximity of the Soviets to the toiling masses creates special forms of recall and other methods of control by the masses, end quote. Lenin called for the development, quote, with specific diligence, end quote, of these special forms of recall and diverse methods of mass control. By means of, quote, practical participation in the management, end quote, of the state, the political and social rule of the proletariat are merged, and that guaranteed power in the hands of the proletariat. The diverse forms of mass control would paralyze, quote, every possibility of distorting the Soviet rule, end quote, remove, quote, the wild grass of bureaucratism, end quote. That was Lenin's practical interpretation of his theoretical elaboration of the state in his State and Revolution, to wit, 1. Control by the workers cannot be carried out by a state of bureaucrats, but must be carried out by a state of armed workers. 2. In a proletarian state, all must be, quote, bureaucrats, end quote, so that no one could be a bureaucrat. 3. The state should be so constituted that it begins to wither away and cannot but wither away. In 1918, Lenin stressed the fact that the expropriation of the capitalists was a comparatively simple problem when contrasted to the more complex one of, quote, creating the conditions under which the bourgeoisie could neither exist nor come anew into existence, end quote. Lenin. It's from the same piece mentioned earlier. In the further development of the Soviet state, Lenin once again realized the practical meaning of the dictum of Marx that a society could, quote, neither clear by bold leaps nor remove by legal enactments the obstacles offered by the successive phases of its normal development, end quote. But Lenin knew that so long as the Soviet state, quote, guaranteed powers to the workers and the poor, end quote, that it need not be fatal to it to, quote, implant, end quote, state capitalism. Not even the most pious worker statist would contend that the workers had any power in the present Soviet state. The most pious worker statist would merely reiterate that so long as there was statified property, etc., etc. But I deny that the social conquest of October 1917, the conscious and active political and practical participation of the masses in liberating themselves from the yoke of Tsarism, capitalism, and landlordism, are to be narrowly translated into mere statified property. That is to say, the ownership of the means of production by a state which in no way resembles the Marxian concept of a worker state, i.e., quote, the proletariat organized as the ruling class, end quote. Dunayevskaya. This expression of Marx is from the Communist Manifesto. Section 2. State capitalism or bureaucratic state socialism. Comrade Shachtman, footnote, Shachtman, 1903-72, is a leader of the Workers' Party who argued that Stalinist Russia was a form of, quote, bureaucratic collectivism, end quote. End footnote. Comrade Shachtman asks, quote, if the workers are no longer the ruling class and the Soviet Union no longer a worker state, and if there is no private property owning capitalist class ruling Russia, what is the class nature of the state and what exactly is the bureaucracy that dominates it, end quote. Shachtman. And Shachtman answers, bureaucratic state socialism because, among other things, the new term elucidates the, quote, distinction from capitalism, end quote, characteristic of the class nature of the Soviet state. I don't think Shachtman would call it bureaucratic state socialism, but maybe I'm jumping ahead. Maybe we have to see what Dunayevskaya has to say. And this is an early writing, you know. She stays writing about this for the rest of her life. So let's see. But how does the mode of production differ under bureaucratic state socialist rule from that under capitalist rule? What is the economic law of motion of this presumably new exploitative society? These crucial points Comrade Shachtman fails to discuss. Let me examine the alleged, quote, distinction from capitalism, end quote, characteristic of the Soviet Union and see whether it isn't a distinction from a certain stage of capitalism, rather from capitalism as a whole. The determining factor in analyzing the class nature of society is not whether the means of production are the private property of the capitalist class or state-owned, but whether the means of production are capital, i.e., whether they are monopolized and alienated from the direct producers. The Soviet government occupies in relation to the whole economic system the position which a capitalist occupies in relation to a single enterprise. I want to repeat that. The Soviet government occupies in relation to the whole economic system the position which a capitalist occupies in relation to the whole economic system. The position... I read it, so you think it would be easier to read it a second time, but apparently not. The Soviet government occupies in relation to the whole economic system the position that a capitalist occupies in relation to a single enterprise. Shachtman's designation of the class nature of the Soviet Union as, quote, bureaucratic state socialism, end quote, is an irrational expression behind which there exists the real economic relation of state capitalist exploiter to the propertyless exploited. Shachtman correctly emphasizes that, quote, the conquest of state power by the bureaucracy spelled the destruction of the property relations established by the Bolshevik Revolution, end quote. Yet he does not see that the, quote, new, end quote, production relations are none other than the relations under capitalism. Shachtman does not even consider the possibility that the, quote, new, end quote, exploitative society is state capitalism. Comrade Trotsky did consider that variant interpretation, but violently opposes defining the Stalinist bureaucracy as a class of state capitalists. Let us see whether Trotsky was justified in his opposition. State capitalism, Trotsky contended, does not exist in Russia, since the ownership of the means of production by the state occurred in history by the proletariat with the method of social revolution, and not by the capitalists with the method of state trustification. Footnote. See Leon Trotsky, The Revolution Betrayed, which of course is available on this channel. But does the manner in which a thing is accomplished determine the use to which it is put by its usurpers any more than each test to be accomplished determines the group to execute it? Quote, the bourgeois character of a revolution, end quote, wrote Trotsky in polemicizing against the Menshevik thesis that since the Russian Revolution was a bourgeois revolution, the proletariat ought to renounce power in favor of the bourgeoisie, quote, could not answer in advance the question as to which class would solve the tasks of the democratic revolution, end quote. Trotsky, The Permanent Revolution. In further expounding his theory of the permanent revolution, Trotsky wrote, quote, socialization of the means of production had become a necessary condition for bringing the country out of barbarism. That is the law of combined development for backward countries, end quote. Precisely. But it is necessary among Marxists to stress the fact that socialization of the means of production is not socialism, but as much an economic law of capitalist development as is monopoly. The weak Russian bourgeoisie was incapable of accomplishing either the democratic tasks of the revolution or the further development of the productive forces. Quote, its, end quote, task was accomplished by the masses with the method of social revolution. However, the task of the young proletarian rulers was greatly complicated by the backwardness of Russia, and the treachery of the social democracy left them unaided by the world proletariat. Finally, the Stalinist counter-revolution identified itself with the state. The manner in which the means of production were converted into state property did not deprive them of their becoming capital. To prove that the particular state monopoly capitalism existing in Russia did not come about through state trustification, but by methods of social revolution, explains its historic origin, but does not prove that its economic law of motion differs from that analyzed by Karl Marx, Engels, and Lenin. It is high time to evaluate, quote, the economic law of motion of modern society, end quote, as it applies to the Soviet Union, and not merely to retain for statified property the same, quote, superstitious reverence, end quote, the opportunists entertained for the bourgeois state. Section 3. No defense of the capitalist society existing in Russia. Because we did not clearly understand the class nature of the present Soviet state, the Soviet Union's integral participation in the Second Imperialist World War came as a monstrous surprise. Footnote. This refers to the signing of the Hitler-Stalin Pact of August 1939, which was followed within a month by the joint Russian and German carving up of East Europe. End footnote. The Red Army march on Poland, the bloody conquest of part of Finland, and the peaceful conquest of the Baltic states proved that the Stalinized Red Army had no more connection with the spirit, purpose, and content of October than has the Stalinist state, whose armed might it is. What an abhorrent relapse from the conquest of October are the Stalinist conquests. Long before the outbreak of World War II, the Russian masses bore the brunt of this, quote, abhorrent relapse, end quote. The workers had a first premonition of it when, as a left oppositionist, he fought the Thermidorians, who deprived him of his job along with his Communist Party membership card. Footnote. The, quote, left opposition, end quote, refers to the political opposition against Stalin grouped around Trotsky from 1923. Quote, Thermidor, end quote, was the month in the calendar adopted by the French Revolution in which Robespierre was overthrown by a reactionary wing of the revolution. Trotsky often used the term to describe those grouped around Stalin after 1923. Wikipedia says, the Thermidor reaction. In the history of the French Revolution, the Thermidorian Convention, is a common term for the period between the ousting of Maximilien Robespierre on the 9th Thermidor II, or 27th of July 1794, and the inauguration of the French Directory on the 2nd of November 1795. The, quote, Thermidorian reaction, end quote, was named after the month in which the coup took place and was the latter part of the National Convention's rule of France. It was marked by the end of the Reign of Terror, decentralization of executive powers from the Committee of Public Safety, and a turn from the radical Jacobin policies of the Montagnard Convention to more moderate positions. Economic and general populism, de-Christianization, and harsh wartime measures were largely abandoned, as the members of the convention, disillusioned and frightened of the centralized government of the terror, preferred a more stable political order that would have the approval of the plurality. The reaction saw the left suppressed by brutal force, including massacres, as well as the disbanding of the Jacobin Club, the dispersal of the Sans-Culottes, and the renunciation of the Montagnard ideology. Back to the text. The glimmer of hope that the worker had when the Stalinist bureaucracy nevertheless adopted the opposition plank for industrialization and collectivization faded as soon as he realized that the development of the productive forces did not raise his standard of living. The worker learned quickly enough that the, quote, socialist fatherland, end quote, knew how to accumulate for other purposes. He would have left the grind of Stakhanovism if the name had not been Russified for him, but had the original Ford-Taylor speed-up insignia. To call the piecework system, which is best suited to capitalist exploitation, quote, socialist working norms, end quote, does not lighten the degree of exploitation of the bricklayer who has to lay 16,000 bricks per day, or for a typist, if I may be permitted a petty bourgeois interest in my own trade, to type 45 pages of 30 lines each and 60 strokes in each line per day. Decreeing, quote, universal, free, and equal suffrage, end quote, does not make it possible for the 14-year-old to vote, quote, no, end quote, to being conscripted in the labor reserves, quote, educated, end quote, read, taught a trade, and at the end of the 2 years training program be put to work on state enterprises for 4 consecutive years, even if this newly educated 16-year-old is guaranteed, quote, the established wage rate, end quote. Is not only that the income of the factory worker is 110 rubles a month, and that of the director 1,200 a month, but that the whole mode of production reproduces the capitalist production relations. State capitalism, it is true, but capitalism nevertheless. Could we have forgotten that state property forms, and it is only form, not relation, for it is without control by the masses, are the aim of proletarian revolution only as a means to achieve the quicker and fullest development of the productive forces, the better to satisfy the needs of man. No, the existence of statified property in Russia does not make its defense imperative, even where the Soviet Union attacked by other imperialist nations for purposes of abolishing statified property, which is less likely just now than the Stalinist state joining the, quote, new order, end quote, of Hitler. Unless we are to change our policy and call for the defense of, say, France, because the work of the German fascists in dividing the country is of a decidedly retrogressive character. It is the irrationality of Shachtman's characterization of the class nature of the Soviet Union as, quote, bureaucratic state socialism, end quote, that leads Shachtman to expound conditional defense of the present Soviet state. It is the real economic relations behind that irrational expression that leads to no defense of the capitalist society existing in Russia. I'm going to repeat that sentence because the end of it is in italics. Is the real economic relations behind that irrational expression that leads to no defense of the capitalist society existing in Russia. Okay, that is the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you got something out of it. There's some footnotes here that I missed, and I'm going to read them now. But if you don't want to listen, that's fine too. The footnote says, quote, Stakhanovism was a system of speed-up of production introduced in Russia in 1935, which led to a rise in income differentiation. It encountered much resistance by the workers. See, for Dunayevskaya's analysis of the phenomenon, see the Marxist-Humanist Theory of State Capitalism, Chicago News and Letters, 1992. Next footnote. So I gotta read that too. Sorry. In the next footnote, I'm assuming everyone knows what Stakhanovism is, but I want to just read the little introduction, the Wikipedia page. The Stakhanovite movement was a mass cultural movement of workers which originated in the Soviet Union and encouraged socialist emulation and rationalization of workplace processes. The Stakhanovites modeled themselves after Alexei Stakhanov, a coal miner, and took pride in their ability to produce more than was required by working harder and more efficiently, thus contributing to the common good and strengthening the socialist state. The movement began in the coal industry, but later spread to many other industries in the Soviet Union. Initially popular, it eventually encountered resistance as the increased productivity led to increased demands on workers. What was I going to say? This is not particularly related, but I was looking up, I typed in piecework in the USSR, and it took me to a wage reform in the Soviet Union between 1956 and 1962. So I'm going to read about what was reformed real quick. It says, the wage reform in the Soviet Union 1956 to 1962. During the Khrushchev era, especially from 1956 through 1962, the Soviet Union attempted to implement major wage reforms intended to move Soviet industrial workers away from the mindset of overfulfilling quotas that had characterized the Soviet economy during the preceding Stalinist period and toward a more efficient financial incentive. Throughout the Stalin period, most Soviet workers had been paid for their work based on a piece rate system. Thus, their individual wages were directly tied to the amount of work they produced. This policy was intended to encourage workers to toil and therefore increase production as much as possible. The piece rate system led to the growth of bureaucracy and contributed to significant inefficiencies in Soviet industry. In addition, factory managers frequently manipulated the personal production quotas given to workers to prevent workers' wages from falling too low. The wage reform sought to remove these wage practices and to offer an efficient financial incentive to Soviet workers by standardizing wages and reducing the dependence on overtime or bonus payments. However, industrial managers were often unwilling to take actions that would effectively reduce workers' wages and frequently ignore the directives they were given, continuing to pay workers high overtime rates. Industrial materials were frequently in short supply and production needed to be carried out as quickly as possible once materials were available, a practice known as, quote, storming, end quote. The prevalence of storming meant that the ability to offer bonus payments was vital to the everyday operation of Soviet industry, and as a result, the reforms ultimately failed to create a more efficient system. So I just wanted to look at that real quick. And the last footnote that I missed, the norms must be higher now. The above norms were effective up to June 26, 1940, at which time the working day was changed from 7 to 8 hours. This decree was supplemented by a law interpreting this lengthening of the workday by instructing the various institutions, quote, to raise the norms of production and lower piece prices in proportion to the lengthening of the working day, end quote. Footnote. Dunayevskaya preferred the name, quote, Russia rather than, quote, USSR, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, because in Dunayevskaya's view, the USSR was neither socialist nor run by actual Soviets and was dominated by Russia. The editor. So, I think that was a very good, interesting piece. Thank you for listening.